What's up guys, this is SkyTech Freak and today we're going to be doing a small form factor PC build in the Fractal Terra. I have it here in the graphite black color of the case, and as many of you might know, this is one of the most popular small form factor PC cases in the market right now. It's also quite expensive, at least here in India. It's priced around 24,000, or at least it was at the time that I bought it. But I think the reason for that is that it's got quite a modern dual tone aesthetic, which tends to blend in with most people's desk setups, and that's why a lot of people are motivated to build in a case that looks so striking. That's the reason I've chosen it for this build. So now let's quickly go over the rest of the parts we'll be using for this build and then get to building in the Fractal Terra. Now for the CPU, I've chosen the Ryzen 7600 non-X version, and the reason for that is it's the cheapest way to get into the AM5 platform without having to spend too much money, and AMD also allows you to overclock these CPUs quite easily, sometimes as easily as turning on Precision Boost Overdrive, PBO. So when you enable PBO, you get pretty close to the performance of the X versions of these chips. So there's not really that much of a reason to choose the 7600X over the 7600 if you're trying to save a little bit of money. So that's the reason I've chosen the Ryzen 7600. You'll see a lot of the parts that I've chosen in this build are trying to be at that price to performance ratio rather than being over the top or extremely budget. Now, the motherboard I've chosen is the ASRock B650i. Again, the reason for that is that it's on the cheaper side of B650 or AM5 ITX motherboards, while at the same time having a lot of good features and a pretty strong, robust VRM. It also has a lot of USB-A ports, which is something that I liked. So that's the reason I've chosen this ASRock B650i Lightning ITX board. I've never built in an ASRock motherboard before, so this will be the first time for me. So I'm excited to see how that goes. As for the RAM, I have chosen the T-Create Pro RAM. These are rated at 6000 megahertz and at the cache latency of CL30. And these are two sticks of 16 GB, so that's a total of 32 GB. And the reason I've chosen these sticks is because they have quite a nice black and gold aesthetic, which kind of goes well with the wooden finish on the Fractal Terra. But more than that, it's also the fact that they are low profile memory sticks, and that'll also help us with our CPU cooler installation, because the CPU cooler I've chosen, and I went over a few options for this. In fact, there were two options that I mainly went through, one being the Deepcool AN600 and the other being the Deepcool AN400. So the main differences between the Deepcool AN600 and the Deepcool AN400 are mostly the size of the fans and the size of the heatsink. So while they both use slim 15mm thick fans, the Deepcool AN600 uses a 120mm fan, and the total height of the heatsink is actually 67mm, while the AN400 uses a 90 or 92mm fan, and the total height of its heatsink is 52mm. So while in any other build, choosing a cooler here would be a no-brainer, right? Because you want to fit the largest CPU cooler possible in the case, it's a little different and a little more interesting in the Fractal Terra because it has something known as a movable spine. So while on paper you can actually fit quite a large CPU cooler for an SFF PC case, what that does is as soon as your CPU cooler gets bigger, it starts to shrink how thick your GPU can get. So it's an interesting game you play of trying to balance out the CPU cooling with the sort of GPU performance you want. And that's why it's interesting to have both these coolers available for me to choose what kind of cooler I want to use. I'm most likely going to go with the Deepcool AN600 because the GPU I've settled on isn't a very thick or large GPU. It's on the much smaller side of GPUs these days, and so it'll allow me to easily fit in the AN600. So I won't have to resort to the smaller AN400. But down the line, if I upgrade my GPU to something bigger, I can always switch coolers into the AN400. And while they both come with this really cool LED in the middle of the fan array, like in the fan hub in the middle, both of these come with sort of a white LED. And while these LEDs aren't RGB, you can't change the colors on them, and they're only white, they do still give off a cool kind of like Iron Man, Tony Stark arc reactor effect when you turn them on. But regardless, I wasn't intending on using the stock fans in either of these coolers. If I had chosen the AN400, what I would have done is swapped it with a Noctua Chromax A9x12 fan, and since I'm now settled on the AN600, I plan on swapping the fan there with Arctic's Slim P12 fan. Now, the reason I planned on swapping the default Deepcool fan in both these coolers with an Arctic or a Noctua fan is just because I expect the Arctic or the Noctua fan to perform better than the default Deepcool fans. But that is also something I can test personally, given that it just involves me removing the fan from the top and swapping it out. So I might just try both fans and see which fan I like the performance of and I prefer to have in the build in this case. One last thing before moving on from the discussion on CPU coolers is that the AN400, with its height of 52 millimeters, including its 15 millimeter fan, can also have its fan swapped out to a full 25 millimeter fan. This is a 25 millimeter fan. I have an Arctic of the same radius, and what that'll do is move the CPU height up from 52 millimeters to 62 millimeters, which is still shorter than the AN600's 67 millimeters, but it allows me to move the spine just one step for a larger GPU. So in case I move to a larger GPU down the line and it doesn't allow me to any longer support the AN600, I can still have the AN400 with a thicker fan, which might still give me better CPU performance. So that's again some kind of thermal and acoustic testing that I'm inclined to do. And if you guys are interested in that kind of a video where I do a bunch of thermal and acoustic testing inside the Fractal Terra, let me know in the comments, and that's something that we can maybe shoot. Moving on from the cooler, since we were already talking about thermals and acoustics, let's quickly go over the 120 millimeter fan that you're allowed to install on the bottom of the Fractal Terra. And for that, again, I've used an Arctic fan. This is Arctic's best fan to date. It's their P12 Max fan, and I'll be installing that to intake air from the bottom at the bottom of the Fractal Terra. And as for storage, I'm going to be using two NVMe Gen 3 drives. I'm not using a Gen 4 drive or a Gen 5 drive. And the reason is because I already have these drives lying around. One is an SN580 1TB, and I'll be using that as the boot drive. And the other is an SN750 4 terabyte, which I'll be using as the games drive because I intend to install a lot of games on this device. So these two bring it up to a total of 5 terabytes already in the system. And I also have a 2 terabyte SATA SSD. This is a Samsung data center SSD, and so I'll mostly be installing I'll mostly be using it for like downloads and sort of storage or backup. It won't be used to install any programs or have any moving parts in it. But yeah, so that's a total of 7 terabytes of SSD space in this build, and that's, I think, the most storage I've ever had in any build without using spinning hard drives. Yeah, so let's move on to the last two parts of this build, and for that we have the GPU, which is the 4070 Super from Nvidia. This is Zotac's twin edge model, and it's one of the smallest 4070s heatsink wise. And the reason I've had this GPU already is because if you guys have seen my Zotac Magnus 1 video, I had first I had a 3060 in there, then I had a 3060 Ti in there, then I had a 3070 in there. There was no 3070 Ti that fit, but I moved on to a 4070, and lastly I was using this 4070 Super in the 10th gen Intel Zotac Magnus 1 that I had. So I've actually used this card before. I've pulled it from the Zotac Magnus 1 because at the end of the day, the 10700 was really beginning to bottleneck performance for me. And so that's another reason why I've actually moved to a new platform like AM5 with DDR5 RAM instead of being stuck on the older platform with DDR4. So yeah, this is the GPU we'll be using, the Zotac 4070 Twin Edge from Nvidia. And lastly, for the power supply, we're going to be using Corsair's SF750. This is actually a brand new unit. Now, I know a lot of the parts in this build aren't the absolute top of the line, but this one is, because power supply is not something you want to cheap out on, especially if it's a build where you plan on upgrading down the path. And this is literally the best power supply that Corsair or anyone makes for small form factor PC builds. I know in 2024 they've come out with an SF850, but in India they only sell the SL850L or the SF1000L, which are longer power supplies. And what that does is that doesn't allow me to install the 120mm fan in the bottom of the Fractal Terra. And I want to install that fan for better thermal performance. So instead, I've gone with an SF, like just a small form factor SFX PSU instead of an SFXL PSU, which would be the 850L or any of the new Asus Thor SFX PSUs. Now, given that this PSU is also an old one, it's actually been manufactured for quite a while now. It doesn't come with the 12 volt high power cable, but Corsair sells that separately, so I picked one of these up. So instead of using that really ugly Nvidia adapter that looks like it's been taped on by a 10-year-old, we get to use a dedicated cable that plugs directly into the PSU for that. So that's all for the parts for this build. Now let's get to building the Fractal Terra, starting with the platform. So it's been a day since I installed this system in the Fractal Terra, and I've used that time mostly for installing Windows, playing my games, and running a few benchmarks on this system. And so I obviously have a few thoughts on performance. This machine, like I said, I built it for 1440p gaming, and it honestly performs really well at that resolution for high refresh rate gaming. But before we move on to the performance of this system, I wanted to address a few things that I came across while building in the Fractal Terra. These are just some notes that maybe if you guys decide to build in the same case, they might help you, and just some things I came across that I'd like to address. So the first thing I'd like to say is that if you guys are actually planning on building in the Fractal Terra and installing a 120mm fan like I have over here, this should be the first thing that you guys do. Given that it's coming right under the PSU, you'll also need a fan grill, and I just don't think that there's a comfortable amount of clearance for you to easily slide that fan in. I had to really wrestle with the Arctic P12 Max to sort of get it down there with the fan grill, and then install the fan grill on top of that. Once it's down there, the 120mm fan is fine, but it just takes some wrestling and pushing for you to push that fan in with the grill. And then when you screw it in, it sort of tightens down, so it becomes a little easier. But I'm just saying that this should be the first thing you guys do, because if you install the PSU or the motherboard or the GPU before you install this fan, it's going to be even harder for you to manage to push that down there. Or maybe you could consider using a slimmer 15mm fan. I've seen a lot of Fractal Terra builds use a 15mm fan instead of the 25mm one, because that makes it much easier for them to slide the fan in, and also cable manage because it gives you that extra 10 millimeters for the cables to come in. The second thing I wanted to address is the movable spine. So after I installed that fan, even though I did think it would be a tight fit and it might actually push against the spine, it wasn't an issue. Even with the fan installed, you're easily able to move that spine. And while, like I mentioned, the Deepcool cooler is a 67 millimeter tall cooler, which means that the position I can put it at is 3, which gives it exactly 67 millimeters of clearance. I've actually pushed the position to 2 to give the CPU cooler a little more space to breathe, because like I've mentioned many times in this video, the GPU is very small and thin GPU. So that way, if I move the position from the default 4 to 2 instead of 3, it gives both the GPU and CPU some space to breathe in and pull in some air. So just the whole concept of an adjustable spine is a real sort of game changer and a real lifesaver if you want to increase either CPU cooling or GPU width down the line. Lastly, I just wanted to say that we've spoken a lot about this Deepcool AN600, so I should talk about how it was a little unnerving to install the thing. On AM5, the Deepcool AN600 actually takes a lot of mounting pressure to get on. They have these like screws that move on to the threads of the mounting mechanism, and you really have to push down on that cooler really hard and then screw it very, very tight for it to even make contact with the threads and actually stay in. I actually thought I was doing something wrong given the amount of mounting pressure it took to install that AN600. So if anyone else is facing the same sort of issue on AM5 and thinking that it's either not lining up or they're having to press down too hard on it, I don't think that that's a user error, but it was a little scary to have to push down that hard on a motherboard with the CPU installed just to install that Deepcool AN600 cooler. Though I will say the performance with the fan swap of the Arctic fan, it has been doing fantastically. But yeah, speaking of performance now, let's go over some of the benchmarks and numbers that I've observed. So let's quickly go over the benchmarks I ran on this system and see what kind of scores and FPS the system was able to achieve. Just for everyone's reference, these were all done at 1440p high settings, since that's the resolution we were targeting with a system like this. And I'll have the benchmark results shown on screen so you guys have some reference to that. Starting with MSI Combustor, where we got a score of 5714 and an average FPS of 95. The second benchmark I ran was Firmark 2, where we got a score of 9938 and an average FPS of 165 with this 4070 Super. The third one was the Heaven Benchmark 4.0, where our average FPS was 320 FPS and a score of 8087. Lastly, we had 3D Mark's new Steel Nomad score, which was 4606, very close to the average score of a system like this. And then we had the Cyberpunk in-game benchmark with the preset of Ray Tracing Ultra and texture quality of high. The average FPS was 93.50 with a minimum FPS way above 60, which was 82.59 FPS. And then I also ran Cinebench R24 for all GPU, CPU single core and CPU multi-core, where the GPU hit an 18,909 points. The CPU multi-core hit 822 points, but earlier I also got an 833 point score, so within a little bit of margin of error. And the CPU single core was 109, and in the past I got 111 on the same system. So that's just some of the performance. Basically, if you just take the average of all these benchmarks, the story that it's telling us is that this performs about on par and average with any 7600 4070 Super system, despite the fact that it's a small form factor PC and has thermal limitations. As far as the games that I've been playing are concerned, I've mostly been playing Marvel Rivals and Fortnite, both of which run at a stable 120Hz at 1440p with no noticeable dips in their 1% lows. So I've been really happy with the performance on this, and I'm really happy with the way the build came together as well. I think I did a really good job cable managing, even though there was very little space in an SFF PC like this. Part of that is thanks to the Corsair SF750 braided cables, which make it really easy to bend those cables and cable manage them well. Of course, Fractal Terra has also got a well thought out and laid out internals for where those cables can go, so it's easy to just push and tuck everything in. But I still think I did a pretty neat job with the build, and I hope you guys agree. I hope you guys liked and enjoyed the video of this build, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, I'm going to continue gaming on this beast.